Good afternoon, welcome. I am Digby Ricci and we continue our series of lectures, Brushing Up the Bard, lectures on Shakespeare's great plays. Today we shall focus on that comedy with a difference, Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. When, in Act 2, Scene 7 of The Merchant of Venice, the unlucky Prince of Morocco mistakenly chooses the golden casket in the hopes that it contains fair Portia's portrait, he discovers that it actually contains a death's head with a scroll tucked into one of its eye sockets. On this scroll there is a verse which contains these very significant and much quoted lines. All that glisters is not gold. Often have you heard that told. Many a man his life hath sold, but my outside to behold. Gilded tombs do worms enfold. These lines present a warning, not simply to a misguided suitor, but, it seems to me, to all those of us who read or study this great text. The Merchant of Venice is a warning, not to judge from superficial appearances, not to cling to wealth and power, and not to forget that beneath the most glittering facade can lurk corruption and even evil. The Merchant of Venice is a study of the spiritual death that often accompanies a commitment to wealth and power. A central theme of this extraordinary play is the way in which persecution and prejudice breed hatred and a desire for revenge. Throughout this complex and disturbing text, Shakespeare emphasizes the fact that oppression and persecution have a brutalizing, even dehumanizing effect on both victims and perpetrators. In short, The Merchant of Venice is a very dark comedy indeed. And even its admirers do not do the play justice by trying to insist that it fit into the category of romantic comedy. There is no reason, of course, that a genius like Shakespeare should not experiment with many different forms of comedy. And in The Merchant of Venice, he certainly does so. The Merchant of Venice is a far more satirical play than, say, great romantic comedies like Twelfth Night and As You Like It. Some critics emphasize a fairy tale element in The Merchant of Venice. Indeed, the great Shakespearean director and commentator, especially in the 1920s, Harley Granville Barker, said notoriously that there's about as much realism in The Merchant of Venice as there is in Jack and the Beanstalk. I disagree with such statements, and I think that it's important to contrast The Merchant of Venice with Shakespeare's famous romantic comedies. Let's focus on the female protagonist. Heroine doesn't altogether apply, I feel. Portia is very different from the enchanting Rosalind of As You Like It and the often very poignant Viola of Twelfth Night. Her wit is scathing and belittling. She does not have the sheer charm of a Rosalind or the poignant introspection of a Viola. And while these heroines need to don male attire, Rosalind has to put on what she calls a swashing and a martial outside in order to express her liberated femininity. The Portia of The Merchant of Venice is a very powerful figure from the outset. She is the heiress of Belmont, immensely wealthy, and despite her self-dramatizing claims that she is a victim of the restraints of her father's will, I shall say a great deal more about the father's will later, she is a figure of authority and influence from the start. And she is not an especially appealing figure. She is by no means the central character of a kind of Renaissance rom-com. Indeed, Leslie Fiedler, the great American critic, makes a very interesting comparison in his fascinating book, The Stranger in Shakespeare. He compares Portia to a Fitzgeraldian heroine, and particularly to Daisy Fay, the very manipulative and ambiguous central figure of The Great Gatsby. Fiedler insists that, like Daisy Fay in Gatsby, Portia is presented to us as a woman high in a white tower, the king's daughter, the golden girl. And Shakespeare presents this powerful golden girl figure very critically indeed. So The Merchant of Venice is far more of a satirical comedy than it is a romantic comedy. And those who argue, and there are some who do so, that the Shylock plot, with its potential for genuine tragedy and its real pain, sits rather uneasily alongside the Jessica subplot and the casket subplot, haven't really looked at those subplots in sufficient detail. Self-centeredness, greed, and a disregard for others, these vices are explored in all sections of this remarkable play. The charge of anti-Semitism that is still directed at The Merchant of Venice is, it seems to me, inaccurate and oversimplified. It is as much a mistake to present the Shylock of The Merchant of Venice as a completely tragic and appealing figure, as, say, the great Victorian actor Henry Irving did, as it is to present him as a chuckling villain. Shakespeare gives us a completely humanized Shylock, warts and virtues and all. He is at times noble, at others petty. He is both avenger and victim. He is cruel and humane. Just, in fact, like all of us, like all human beings. It is very important to note in The Merchant of Venice what the great critic A.D. Moody, whose essay on this very text was extremely influential, called the powerful, pervasive irony of Shakespeare's writing. This irony enables us to see that what Moody calls the varnished reality of the Christians conceals a complacent disregard for the very values that they claim to espouse. Moody argues very persuasively that the Venetian Christians paid constant lip service to forgiveness, to mercy, and to divine law, but they certainly do not practice what they preach. Moody's great essay had a considerable influence on me, and I fully agree with him when he points out that The Merchant of Venice makes readers and viewers uneasy because it forces us to look at how many double standards we ourselves have. Do we ever remain true to the virtues that we claim to support? Do we ever behave with consistent morality? Or are we not rather like the glittering, often appealing, but ultimately hypocritical Venetian Christians of Shakespeare's play? I've mentioned A.D. Moody's superb, ice-breaking essay on The Merchant of Venice, and it changed people's thinking about this remarkable play. But I must also pay tribute to Harold C. Goddard, whose 2-volume work, The Meaning of Shakespeare, has always had a great impact upon me, and I've cited it often during the course of these lectures. Goddard is especially illuminating on the trial scene of The Merchant of Venice. So, The Merchant of Venice is a very dark comedy indeed, which forces us to confront the fact that hatred will inevitably breed hatred, and that persecution will breed often appalling vengeance. For me, one of the most profound lines in The Merchant of Venice, one of the most profound lines in any text, in fact, ends Shylock's great hath not a Jew eyes speech. He says to the Venetian Christian tormentors of him, the villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. In other words, beware if you abuse, persecute, and demonize me, for I will be as demonic as you expect me to be, and I might even surpass you in this terrible game. It seems to me that many saddening lessons about history and about current affairs are encapsulated in those extraordinary lines. Think of some historical examples. The massacre, Bloody Sunday, of 1905 in Tsarist Russia inevitably breeds the atrocities of the Bolsheviks. The imposed poverty, crippling taxation, and injustice of pre-revolutionary France inevitably lead to the excesses of the terror and the despotism of Robespierre. And we can think of many modern parallels. The villainy you teach me, I will execute. The central tragic point of this very black comedy indeed. The original source of the narrative of Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice is a 14th century Italian collection of tales, Il Pecorone, or The Dunce. But a very important, more recent for Shakespeare influence is, of course, Christopher Marlowe's play, The Jew of Malta. It is dated approximately 1589, and it was performed with great popularity in the 1590s. The Jew of Malta can certainly be regarded as an anti-Semitic work, but then it is only fair to say that it is a misanthropic work. It could be seen as a humanity-bashing work. The great poet and critic T.S. Eliot described the Jew of Malta memorably as a savage farce, and it is certainly that. The prologue to the Jew of Malta is delivered by a demonized Machiavelli, and in fact the Jew of Malta's central figure, Barabbas, the vicious Jewish plutocrat, is a Machiavellian villain. In fact, he is the prototype of Machiavellian villains in Elizabethan drama. However, the play contains lustful, hypocritical friars, brutal, blundering Turkish commanders. Every single figure is attacked in the Jew of Malta, except for Barabbas's pitiful daughter, Abigail. So Marlowe's Jew of Malta uses broad caricature, crude satire. The Merchant of Venice is a far more subtle text. Indeed, it does an injustice to Shakespeare to say that Shylock is a kind of humanized Barabbas. He is much more than that. Shylock is a multifaceted, in many respects, tragic figure, very different from the engaging, cartoonish villain who gives the title to Marlowe's also great, if problematic, text. It is important to note that Shakespeare chooses Venice as the setting of his play for a very good reason. Modern readers and viewers of The Merchant of Venice must think of Venice in the way Elizabethans would have thought of it, as a center of style and commerce, a glittering commercial city. Think of it like New York today, or swinging London in the 1960s, and you will get an idea of how Elizabethan audiences would have regarded Venice. A merchant within Venice would have been a very powerful and wealthy figure indeed. The Merchant of Venice, of the title of Shakespeare's play, is of course Antonio, and he is the first figure that we meet. And it is interesting that his opening lines are all about melancholy, sadness. But remember, the Elizabethans were very aware that melancholy is a kind of psychological disease. They regarded it very accurately as we would regard depression today. Indeed, see melancholy as a synonym for depression. Antonio, the merchant of Venice, is depressed, and what he calls his want-wit sadness, a wonderful phrase, it means foolish melancholy, bewilders him and irritates his friends. He can think of no cause for it. Antonio's young friends, Salerio and Solanio, fashionable Venetian hedonists, are quick to come up with explanations. And it is interesting to note that all of their explanations relate to anxiety about commercial ventures. They essentially say, oh, if I were you, I would certainly be thinking all the time about my argosies. Argosies are great merchant ships, and what could happen to them. These two young men describe in very powerful terms the tragedies that could befall Antonio's argosies. His precious spices could be scattered all over the waves of the sea, or in a wonderful image, his silks could enrobe those foaming waves. All his treasures could be lost because storms, rocks, and sand flats can wreck the most imposing of vessels. The vulnerability of Antonio's trade, his career as a merchant, is emphasized very strongly. It is important to note, however, that this focus entirely on material aspects of life can be regarded very critically indeed. And I think that Shakespeare is certainly critical of this typical Venetian attitude. Salerio and Solanio even stress that they couldn't go to church and gaze at the holy edifice of stone without immediately thinking of rocks that could pierce the sides of a great trading vessel. Their obsession is with wealth and the accumulation of wealth. And this is the dominant attitude of a city like Venice. Antonio, however, denies their explanations. He says that he is not especially worried about his ventures. He has so many ventures abroad that surely many of them will be successful. And he also denies with some force the suggestion that he could be in love. Fie, shame, he says. The garrulous and shallow Gratiano insists that Antonio's melancholy stems from the fact that Antonio wishes to gain a reputation as a solemn man by being always sober and sad. Antonio himself suggests that maybe this is his role in life. Everyone has a different role in the theatre of existence, and his role is a sad one. The mystery then of Antonio's melancholy remains, but I think that Shakespeare is making a more subtle general point, that in an opulent, wealthy, and we would say in more colloquial terms, money-mad society, happiness is not guaranteed. Joy and the pursuit of wealth do not automatically go together. And thus, the merchant of Venice himself, Antonio, is dominated by want, wit, sadness. And to leap ahead for a moment, it is interesting that when we are introduced to Portia, the heiress of Belmont, her country estate, the name means beautiful mountain, she too is in a state of depression. Her first line is a dramatic one in which she says to her lady-in-waiting Nerissa, "My little body is a weary of this great world." Wealth does not guarantee happiness. There is a hollowness, a spiritual emptiness about Venetian society as it is depicted very satirically by Shakespeare in this play. Antonio's special friend, Bassanio, approaches him and asks, essentially, for the loan of more money. Now, Bassanio, many people still insist on seeing as the dashing hero of a romantic comedy. But Shakespeare's lines do not really support this impression. It is a mistaken and simplistic view. Bassanio speaks openly to his friend Antonio about how he has squandered his wealth. He has disabled, very interesting verb that he uses there, his estate, his inheritance. And why has he done so? Because he wishes to present a more impressive appearance than he can afford to sustain, or as he puts it, a more swelling port, a more imposing appearance. He is a spendthrift, in other words, and he is living a false existence. He plans to regain his wealth by marrying well. And it is interesting that when he first mentions Portia, the object of his pursuit, he says, "In Belmont is a lady, richly left, and she is fair." And then he mentions her great virtues. Look at that order, it's very interesting. Money first, then beauty, and then goodness. That pretty much sums up the prevailing attitude of the Venetian Christians in this very probing text. In the lectures that follow, I will examine the pound of flesh, the conflict between the Venetian Christians and the Jewish usurer Shylock, and the resolution of the text. I trust you will join me for the 2 lectures that follow on the Merchant of Venice.